keep in mind while listening that I'm choosing to remain open-minded because I simply can't think of any explanation for the events that happened. From 2012 to 2013, I did quite a lot of hiking in and around the coastal range in Oregon. I frequently would go out by myself for days at a time and only come into town to restock on food if necessary. It was commonplace for when I was in town to spend the entire day hiking back the 4 hours to where I was camping at dusk. The trail I took was not well traveled and looked more like a deer path than anything. I had actually chosen my campsite specifically for its lack of foot traffic and its serenity, avoiding conventional locations altogether. I only had a cell phone on me during this period of hiking and camping. No bright clothing, no GPS tracking device, or emergency beacon either. Looking back, that probably was not the smartest idea. There were times when I heard and saw things while out in the forest that I didn't recognize by sight or sound, but nothing came close to this incident I had in May 2013. I had just done my usual restock in a small town some 6 miles from where I had decided to camp for the night, and I spent the whole day in town and walking back as usual. By the time I had started to walk back to my camp location though, it was about dusk. Half of the walk I chose to use dirt roads, until veering off onto the deer trail I used earlier in the day. By this time, it was now completely dark out, but it was still clear enough that it was possible to see the trail using only the moonlight. I don't tend to listen to headphones or things like that while hiking. I've always thought it wise instead to be able to hear what's around me in the event there was a predator, whether human or animal or whatever. At that moment, I was mentally doing some calculations for the next day's hike, when my mind just stopped mid-track. I hadn't heard anything specifically, and I don't make hardly any sounds when hiking. If I had heard something, I'm sure I would have known. But for some reason, be it a sixth sense or survival instinct, I'm not sure, I was suddenly jolted out of mid-thought. I was now very aware I was not alone on this trail. What was odd to me especially is that even though I had heard nothing whatsoever, light wind and no birds around, I knew acutely that something was right behind me, specifically about 30 yards down the trail hidden away in some bushes. I still to this day have so many unanswered questions about how I could just feel this presence there. Standing really still, I turned around to look down the trail. I didn't see anything, but I could still feel that presence right there. It's honestly really difficult to pin down exactly how to describe what I was feeling, because I haven't felt that way before or since. It was straight up fight or flight, and my logical mind was saying there was nothing out of the ordinary, while all of my senses were telling me I needed to run right now. Again, looking back and remembering this, I have no idea what this was. It's really hard to describe in writing actually. It was like I was being taunted almost, and I felt that. The presence of some animal or some person was down that trail, and for some reason I knew it knew that I knew it was there, even though I couldn't actually see it. That's what still scares me to this day. Somehow I could just tell that it knew. It was bright enough out for me to see down the trail 30 yards back no problem, but I still couldn't see anything. This was maybe about 30 seconds of looking down there, if that. I was panicking, but I still wasn't sure what to think. I wasn't exactly seeing anything threatening. I turned around and started walking at a quick pace. I mean, what else could I really do? I knew for a fact that if it was a guy out to kill someone, he was probably most likely going to end up killing me on this trail, or in my tent after following me back. At this point, why even run? That was my logical thought. I would say it was not even a minute into the quick trek back when I heard what can only be described as a rushing sound or swooping air, followed by what sounded like a rake sliding across the dirt trail, the former sound happening right after the latter. It happened 4 times, and each time they were getting progressively closer to me. 20 yards back, 15 yards back. Looking back, I don't know how I was able to stay composed in that moment and not soil myself. Somehow though, I mentally stayed focused on getting back to my tent. I ignored the panic and kept walking quickly, not daring to look back. Whoever or whatever it was followed me for the majority of the next hour. I just kept heading forward though, and still did not look back. A few minutes from my camp location, that fight or flight feeling gradually but succinctly left, and I crawled into my tent. I couldn't sleep a single wink that entire night. When morning came, I looked around and walked back the way I came in. I did see some tracks, but I don't know exactly what they were. Perhaps a mountain lion or something. I'm just glad I never had to actually deal with it. I used to do a lot of camping and hunting with my dad back in the day. We lived in Michigan, so going up north was a common activity for us. I think the main difference between us and other people who did the same thing was that my dad liked to go way off the beaten path, like really, really deep into the woods. Often he would end up parking the truck somewhere once we couldn't go any further, and we would hike for several miles on carrying all of our gear. The very last time we went camping was definitely the weirdest one. My dad was really excited because he had just gotten a new full-wheel drive. He wanted to see just how far he could push this thing. After a lot of driving and some quite scary I thought I was going to die experiences, we ended up in this really small clearing. It was nearly dark out at this time, so we quickly made up a tent, had some food, and went to bed. When we woke up the next morning and it was bright out, we got a better idea of the clearing. It seemed to have been a common campsite, or at least that was the evidence. There was an area someone had a fire, firewood, and the grass was compressed in other areas too, like someone had walked there for a while. I think there may have also been some trash littered about as well. As we continued to explore this area further, I found what I called a swamp. It was like a bed of water where trees and branches had fallen into and were growing out of. It had a very eerie quality, but more than the atmosphere, I was afraid of hidden snakes. After checking that out, my dad decided we were going to walk even further into the forest. The trees were extremely thick here, and there was no way our truck would be able to get through. We were walking for maybe an hour or so when we came upon a second clearing. Before we even got close though, we could hear something in the distance. As we approached further, we began to discover the source. The area went immediately from this extremely dense forest into this open area with low grass, and directly in front of us was an old wooden cabin. In front of it there were rusted out cars that seemed to be impossibly placed due to just how dense the trees around were. To the left of us was this huge cliff that seemed to shoot straight down. Coming from the cabin was that noise. As we approached further, we could tell immediately it was a woman screaming. What she was screaming, I wasn't quite sure. I couldn't make it out, but she was obviously raving mad about something. I remember wanting to check out the cliff more, but my dad stopped me very suddenly. He stared like he was trying to figure something out and told me to turn back around immediately. We began sprinting back to the campsite, and when we got there, he immediately had us pack up everything, get back into the truck, and leave right away. I'm not sure what it was he saw that made him react like that, but it was enough to really scare him, which I had never seen before. We were both armed, and my dad had earned various medals in the army for rifle use and sharpshooting. He was an amazing shot, and when he had his gun with him, his bravery seemed endless. I think that's what creeps me out the most about this experience. Whatever this was that scared him, he knew he couldn't protect me or himself from it, even with his gun on him. So, this is not crazy as some things you've perhaps heard on here, but it's a genuine experience that's always had me wondering. I work as a broadcast engineer, and a few years ago I received a phone call at around 9:30 or 10 p.m. from the on-duty ENG that our OTA, over-the-air signal, had gone out. We were off the air on our OTA platform. The call was with several other ENGs, as well as my boss at the time. We had figured out that the problem was our transmitter, and it needed to be corrected manually. My boss asked for someone to volunteer to go with him, and after a few seconds of awkward silence, I offered to go. So our RF transmitter site was located on top of Beacon Mountain in Beacon, New York, which was about an hour plus from our station. At the time, I had never actually been up there, so of course, going in the middle of the night was quite spooky. I met my boss and we drove down together. We got to the mountain a little bit before midnight. The road up to the mountain to the transmitter site was a long, narrow, windy, and steep dirt road with a lot of big, loose rocks as well. The drive up was scary enough on its own. I can't emphasize enough just how dark this drive was either. It was completely pitch black. A few times while going up, we would see headlights coming towards us of people out with their off-road Jeeps. This wouldn't be as weird if it weren't in the middle of the night. We also saw 2 different campfires deep off into the woods, which I assumed were groups of locals hanging out and drinking or something. My boss told me that locals tended to hang out near the transmitter site sometimes and should be avoided at all costs. They had a tendency to be very sketchy. It didn't seem too sketchy to me, but what did I know? It was my first time there after all. My boss also told me he never traveled to that mountain without a gun. He said it was more than just the locals. I've seen stuff out here I can't really explain. We get to the top, do our work on the transmitter, and close up everything. We had just started to head back down. As we were going, we were at this particularly steep part of the road where you pretty much have to ride your brake because the car won't stop till the incline levels out a little. All of a sudden, 3 deer sprinted out in front of us, not even looking at our oncoming car. This caused us to swerve since we were already riding the brake. The front of the car smacked against a rock, which stopped our momentum. My boss instantly turned the car off, and once the sound of the engine died, we could hear something big running in the opposite direction away from the road, up the natural slope of the hill. I shined my flashlight in that direction, but whatever it was already out of sight. We could still see branches moving though, and leaves being disturbed by whatever was moving that way. I asked my boss if he thought that was another deer or possibly a bear. He replied to me, "Can't be, bears run on all 4s. Whatever that was ran on 2 legs. And bears don't usually actively hunt deer anyway. Something was definitely chasing them." When we first heard footsteps, I would estimate they were as close as 10 to 15 feet from the car. The thing had started to run away, but now it appeared to be standing over us as there was a natural incline up the mountain. There are a lot of logical explanations for this, like my boss was just trying to scare me, or perhaps it was a local walking or running through the woods. But there are a few things to consider here. Yes, it could have been a person walking alone through the woods, but why would all those deer be running away from them? And why would it be chasing them? Why would they run away from our car and hide to watch us as well? Also, whatever ran away there was out of sight very quickly, within 3 to 4 seconds of starting to run uphill. I imagine a person would have to be in the greatest shape ever to run that quickly up this steep hill, but what do I know? It sounded too big to be a bobcat or mountain lion or coyote, but I'm not too experienced with that sort of thing, so it's entirely possible. My boss is not the kind of guy that would try to scare people. He's a very stern, all-business type of guy. He seemed pretty rattled as well by this and wanted to get out of there ASAP. I ended up going back to that mountain many more times before leaving for a new job, but I never saw or heard anything like that night. I also never went back after sunset though. I no longer work for this company, and the company no longer owns that transmitter site anyway, so likely I'll never have a reason to go back. I don't know of any reported sightings or experiences with anything in that area, but I do know that over the years there have been an abnormal number of car accidents over that road. I assume most of them are due to the poor conditions, but it really makes me think. I was almost killed 6 years ago by a friend, and it kind of dabbles into the paranormal at times. This took years for me to be able to talk about. I'm still dealing with the PTSD associated with this event. So 6 years ago, myself and a male friend who we'll call Sam decided we wanted to go camping. I'd known him for years, and he was one of my best friends. I wasn't weirded out by going camping alone with him because of this. I decided to invite a girlfriend along though too. The more the merrier after all. We decided to go camping at the spot I hadn't been to in a couple of years. I still remembered the basic general description to get there though. We stopped at a gas station outside the last tiny town and asked to make sure we were going the right way. The attendant pointed and said, "Follow the storm." Sure enough, huge black clouds were forming in the direction of our campsite. I mean, this is to date the most terrifying storm cloud I'd ever seen. And what's a story without a crazy storm, am I right? We sit in the car and discuss possibly going home, but being the badasses that we are, we decided to tough it out instead. We all like camping in the rain during storms anyway. So, we start driving onto this dirt road in the middle of nowhere. As we're getting closer to the campsite, I start to feel this horrible feeling. Just horrible. There's no way to really explain it. I just had this indistinct feeling that something bad was going to happen. We eventually decided to turn around because the storm was so bad. The lightning was hitting right outside our car, and it seemed way too dangerous to continue. We started to head back towards town, but the second we leave the forest, boom, no storm. Well, okay. The storm is localized in the area, it seemed, so we'll just go camp somewhere else. About 20 minutes from our town, there's a reservoir with a man-made lake and a few camping spots in various areas. We park there instead, pack up our stuff, and start on the trail that runs around the lake so we could find a spot with a bit more privacy. The spot where we parked our car was right at the opening to the trail, and a couple was camped at a spot right there. We stopped and chatted casually with them. They seemed pretty cool, so we invited them to head our way in about an hour. After we'd set up shop, we'd all play games and drink together. We get to our spot and set up camp, and I randomly get a text message on my phone from another friend. This was weird because cell service was super shoddy out in this area. She was an artist friend of mine whose stars have risen greatly in the last few years. I explained to her where we were. She said, "Great. I've been looking for a really big fire recently. I'm on my way." Kind of an odd statement, but artists are strange people, I guess. She smokes a lot of weed as well, so I don't understand half of what she says half of the time. So let's fast forward time here for the sake of my story. We're having a great time, that other couple comes over, and we're drinking, having a blast. My artist friend shows up with this monstrosity of a statue. She said she made it in her college freshman art class, and it had brought her bad luck for 4 years or something. She wanted to burn it in the fire. I wish to God I had some sort of bad feeling about it or something, but I'm not really one to believe in supernatural weird things. We all laughed and threw it in the fire. Fast forward a couple hours, my artist friend brought her weed out and smoked with my friend Sam for a couple of hours as well. Now, Sam was mixing liquor and weed. Rita and I don't smoke. It started to get dark, and the new couple headed back towards their camp. My artist friend decided to head home since she wasn't planning on spending the night. It was just us original three now. About this time, Sam started to act very weird. We laughed it off as cross-faded, which nearly cost me my life. It started off with him changing his voice. He went from normal tones to very low, dark, and gravelly. He sounded almost like a different person. We thought he was just getting more fucked up. Then it got even worse though. He started to babble nonsense. It started off pretty quietly, but it got more understandable as he went on. He pulled Rita aside and told her he worked for the CIA, had millions of dollars in offshore accounts, and could make any of us disappear in an instant and get away with no issue. Please keep in mind this is one of my absolute best friends, and I never felt the least bit scared around him. We just laughed off these veiled threats. Haha, okay, drunk ass. About this time, though, Rita noticed that her hatchet we were using for firewood had suddenly gone missing. We searched everywhere, but it was just way too dark. We gave it up as a lost cause until sunup. Sam was still muttering dark nonsense to himself, sitting on the opposite side of the fire pit. Eventually, he passed out. Rita and I stayed up, chuckling about how weird he was acting and congratulating ourselves on a pretty fun night. About an hour later, we start to feel raindrops. That damn storm we'd driven away to avoid is getting ready to dump all over our heads. Oh well, it's late. We'll get drunky in the tent and go to bed. This is where shit gets real though. We shook him gently until he moaned. We explained that it was starting to rain. Time to go to bed. He struggled up and Rita and I each grabbed a side and hauled him to the tent. We stopped in front of the tent to unzip it. When Sam totally just went nuts. It was out of this world, like he was possessed by the devil himself. I'm not even being dramatic about this. He just randomly started screaming, this horrible high-pitched sound I'll never be able to get out of my nightmares. I was bent over, so I missed the swing that got Rita thrown back. He turned around, quite gracefully I might add, drunken stupor almost totally gone, and kicked out the last coals from the fire. This was happening in a matter of seconds, but time was slowed down for me. I remember every tiny detail. So the fire is out now. The campsite is 100% pitch black. No moon because of those storm clouds above. The next thing I know, Sam is standing next to me. So close I could feel him breathing. Then all of a sudden I'm on the ground. I was hit hard enough for the air to be completely knocked out of me. Not that I'd be able to breathe anyways, because Sam was now sitting on my stomach with his hands wrapped very tightly against my throat. He was strangling me with all of his very significant strength. Sam was one of those super tall muscular types that had those crazy long monkey arms. I was reaching up trying to push him off me, but his arms were so damn long I could barely even touch his chest. I was scraping at his arms and buckling underneath him, trying to get him off of me. I could hear Rita screaming my name, trying to find where I was. At this point, I was starting to black out. It seemed like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably a few minutes tops. Through my quickly fading vision, I could see Rita now punching and fighting Sam, trying her hardest to get him to let go. She was a rugby player, so she's pretty scrappy. I blacked out for a few minutes here, so I only have Rita's version of the story to go on after this. After I went limp, apparently Rita freaked out. I mean, understandably, she thought he had just killed me. She went into overdrive and started kneeing him in the face. After a few hits, that was enough to stun him and make him let go. She pushed him aside and hauled me up, still unconscious. Seriously, go Rita. Dead weight is no easy thing to manage. I guess I was out for a couple of minutes, but when I came to, she was dragging me down the path crying quietly. I came to pretty full force, and I immediately freaked out. Hysterics naturally. Screaming, crying, shaking uncontrollably. Rita was telling me to shush. Sam hadn't followed us apparently, but we certainly didn't want him to start now. I managed to control myself a bit and started carrying my own weight to walk. To add insult to injury, my flip-flops had fallen off during the attack, and now I was walking barefoot on a horribly rocky path. This was not pleasant, and I could feel the cuts forming already. Rita, being the fucking badass she is, took off her sandals and let me have them. Seriously, this girl is better than Jesus. From our campsite to the parking lot was about 15 minutes, probably longer with my recent trauma, but it was still silent behind us. Sam seemed to have been left far behind. When we were close enough to the new couple's camp, which was right next to the parking lot, we started screaming for help. The girl, being reasonably frightened, stayed in the tent, but the guy came out to the path to find out what was wrong. We explained the whole attack an almost dead situation. He pulled out his gun with the intention of walking back to our campsite to confront Sam. Luckily, his girlfriend came out at this point and convinced him that instead of a murder charge, it would be far better to instead get a cell service so we could call 911. We were walking towards their car when we realized there was a camp manager a couple hundred yards away. Perfect. We headed towards that. Knocked on the door, cried hysterically, and explained everything that was going on. A very nice lady got us some water bottles while her husband called the police. They sat us on their couch to wait, and for some reason, I remember seeing there were 5 deadbolts on the door. There was no way Sam was getting through that. A half hour later, about a dozen cops and an ambulance showed up. The cops took our story and headed up to find Sam, asking if he was armed. We said we don't know. We explained the missing hatchet and the knife I had in my purse. They go out armed. Rita and I still loaded into the ambulance. An officer came to the door before it closed and stated that they found Sam. He was still waiting at the campsite. He was also completely naked, bleeding from the minor wounds Rita and I had managed to inflict, holding that hatchet and laughing. The officer said he was mumbling something about being possessed by the devil, still talking total nonsense. The officer asked if he had done any drugs. We said he'd smoked and drank as well. Perhaps the weed could have been laced by something. The rest is fairly dull. My first ever ambulance ride, a very pricey emergency visit, a lot of drugs, and a CT scan to check for internal swelling in my neck. They wanted to keep me overnight, but there was no way that was going to happen. My cat is my therapy animal and he was home. I was going home now, end of story. To add insult to injury, when I got home I realized that because I'd been having roommate troubles, I'd locked my bedroom door with my cat inside, and my keys had been left at the campsite. I could hear him meowing through the door while I just sobbed my eyes out, locked on the other side. I was too loaded up on drugs to go anywhere, so Rita, in a final spur of awesome, went with her mom and went out to get all of my stuff. All of us were at 24 hours of no sleep. So, that's my story. The rest is the obvious stuff. Charges, prosecution, court, a lot of physical and mental anguish. He pled guilty. The judge asked him if he wanted to make a statement, but he didn't. I never got an apology for almost ending my life. Sometimes I guess there's no definite closure. I never believed in bad luck, superstition, possession, or any of that stuff, but I'm 100% positive burning that stupid statue is what caused him to snap that night. He wasn't a dangerous person, and he had never been violent before. That statue brought my artist friend bad luck, and clearly had some bad spirits or something in it that we let go. That's the most detailed account I've ever given about this event. I attend a group therapy program at the eastern edge of Katy Country, on Cape Cod. We've lost several people, either because they just stopped coming or they graduated. My first week there this May, it was a gentleman who was there for about 2 days. Then he just stopped coming altogether. He smoked like a chimney, so every break he'd be out in the smoking area. I sat down and introduced myself. He introduced himself to me as Ralph. Ralph seemed to smoke a butt in just one drag. This impressed me, but at the same time made me wince a bit. As he was lighting up another cigarette, he began to mumble to himself. Then, out of nowhere, he started talking to me about serial killers. Now, I'm on the autism spectrum, and I have just a tad bit of trouble reading people.
Yeah, dude, I'm so done with my girlfriend. I want to kill her, then fuck the ever-living shit out of her body and tell her I won.
At first, I didn't think I could have possibly heard him correctly. I asked if he could repeat what he just said, and he repeated word for word. By this time, other people were now coming out to smoke. Sarah, one of the people in the dual diagnosis group, came over and sat at the table. I think she could tell that in this moment Ralph was becoming unhinged. He dragged her into the conversation too.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go Ted Bundy on my girlfriend. Gonna kill her, then fuck her body. You think that's a good idea, right?
Sarah got wicked angry. Sarah and I immediately got up and went inside, and moments later we reported him. Minutes later, a cruiser and ambulance showed up to haul him off, and we haven't heard from him ever since. This is why I hate the fact that state hospitals in Massachusetts are closing. We get folks like Ralph. Ralph obviously needs help, and I really don't hope we ever cross paths with him again. I also hope the cops informed his girlfriend in the end too. This takes place in Grand Rapids, Michigan. About 18 years ago, when I was 17 or 18 years old, I was living across the state from Grand Rapids. I was a senior in high school, and I had a lot of friends who had recently graduated and gone off to college. One particular weekend, a friend and I decided to take a trip to see some of our old friends from high school and spend the weekend at their house. When we got there, we realized the house was down this weird dead-end street. It was like a normal city neighborhood, but you could turn down this one almost unnoticeable street that looked almost like an alleyway, and there were about 5 to 10 houses down it. They were all in really bad shape. When we got there, it was a really big and old 5-bedroom house. There were a couple people living there. Most of them I was just meeting for the first time. We met and all got along pretty well. We were all having a great time together actually. Then they started telling me though about how weird this street was and how all the neighbors had been living there for a really long time. We started partying, and my friend started telling me he loved living in the house. Things were a bit weird though, because he was a really curious dude. He said the landlord had told them specifically when they first moved in that he knew they were going to be partying a lot and doing typical young college kid stuff. He told me after the landlord told him he didn't care what they did. The only rule he had in the house, and he was very adamant about this, was to never under any circumstances try to open the doors to the basement. Obviously, this point piqued my interest as well. After a brief discussion, we headed down to see it. It was striking. Now, to set this up visually, the basement was like one of those very old basements where everything is made out of cement. It was super dirty and long, and had big cement support pillars down the middle. There was nothing in it. On the other side of the room were these doors, big, huge doors, and when I saw them, my heart sank. I could see both doors had about 1,000 nails in them, all over. Some were bent and sticking out. It looked like the wood was cracked, and like someone had been frantically nailing this thing shut as hard as they could. Both of them. We discussed it for a while, and decided not to open those doors. Honestly, I kind of regret it. I still think about it from time to time. I have no idea what was behind them. We've discussed so many possibilities. What, an old unused well? If so, why would they be on both sides of the house? Maybe some old tunnels or catacombs maybe. The house was really old. The ultimate reason my friend didn't want to open those doors in the end is because he was afraid a poltergeist was trapped in or something. I just laughed that off. I don't even think the house is actually still there, but I know they asked the landlord again what was behind those doors. All he would ever say is, "Just promise me you'll never try and open them." How strange.